Thank you very much. We'll now open up to questions. Turning to the opposition, Mr. Kimmick, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. So my questions will be for the Deputy Minister first. What is the total inventory of applications, including those beyond service standards right now?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think what we can indicate to you is from January to October, the department has made 6.2 million final decisions. So that's year to date, and that's for TR, PR, and citizenship. And we've got 7 million expected for this year. So those are probably kind of the total numbers. In terms of how many of those for PR are in service standard, as of October 2023, I would say 55% are within service standard for the PR program, which compares to 40% back in July of 2022 at the time of the beginning of the audit. I can also indicate that we, and if helpful for the committee, kind of where we were with the 8 programs, where none were in compliance of the service standard. Where we are now, we have a significant progress to report. So for federal skilled worker, we're now in service standard, so within 6 months or less. And right now it's closer to 5. We are down in the Quebec selected skilled worker program. It was at 20 months at the time of the audit. It's at 13 months. We still need a bit of work to get into service standard, but we've made significant progress.
Sorry, Deputy Minister, I'm going to interrupt you because I don't get all that much time at this committee especially. In the AG report, it said that for 2 of the programs, so the PSR program and the GAR program, there were no service standards set. And the AG report says that the department said that there were no plans to make there be service standards. That's what it says in the AG report. But then in your detailed management action plan, it says you have a plan. So how can it be, what changed between when the AG did the audit and said the department says we have no plans to comply with Treasury Board guidelines, directives, to now there's a detailed plan. In fact, it has like multi-step process and months in action. So what changed between no plan to there is a plan now?
I think what I can say in response to that question is when I joined the department in the summer of 2022, we were at a pretty high point of service backlogs and service challenges. And the first thing that we endeavored to do is to try to meet the service standards that we had before we start committing to shortening them, adding service standards to lines of business. So priority number 1 was around let's try to get through this kind of crisis of backlog and get to more normal service standards. Part 2, exactly aligned with where the AG recommended for us to go, is to look at service standard for all of our lines of business, including GARs and PSRs, and I can speak to some of the challenges around that.
I'm going to interrupt you again, Deputy Minister.
It is part of the plan. It is part of the immigration levels, and we are moving forward on setting service standards.
So you have a plan right now, but then who told the AG's office there was no plan to comply with Treasury Board directives? Was it the previous Deputy Minister?
I'm not sure exactly who would have had that conversation from my team, but what I can say is that we are committed, and that is stated in the immigration levels plan, to looking at service standards for the refugee programs, including our GARs and PSRs.
So in my discussions with the AG's office, I have an email from them. I had questions about the continuing use of those GCMS codes of former employees. And in a pool of 6,000 that they looked at, there are 57 codes that are still in use. And there were 57 applications identified. 2 of the applications were submitted in November of 2018. These are the oldest. That's 4.5 years old at the time of the Auditor General's review, April 2023. 1 application was May 2019, which means it was 4 years old. The majority of other applications were submitted in 2022. I thought the use of the GCMS codes had been stopped, like assigning them to old employee numbers. In the case of at least one person's been waiting patiently since November 2018, that's 4.5 years. So is there an error rate where it's still happening in the drop-down menus or something where people are assigning them to the wrong ones? Is this practice continuing in the department to assign them to former employees who are not there? We were told that the AG's office was told that this is a management technique being used by different offices to simply manage their workload. But 4.5 years is a long time to wait to have your application considered. And in many cases, like it just looked at this application may have been completely forgotten.
So I think what I can say is that I think at the time of the use of GCMS numbers, they weren't necessarily, because they were assigned to perhaps an older employee, it didn't mean that a new person couldn't come in and take a look at that code. So I'm not going to comment specifically on the 2018 case, because I think what I have found in my role in this department is there are times where a file has been sitting for a long time and it gets to my attention either because of a direct client outreach or because it's raised by, a member of parliament, and we dig into it. And at times it's also because of, we notice that there could be a missing document, there could be an abandoned file, there could be a security check that's not complete, there could be a material change in the application that makes it such that it requires more time. So I can't speak to the 2018 case that you've brought forward, but what I can say is that those numbers are, I don't think they're in use anymore. And we kind of took that to account last year when this first surfaced. So I don't think they're being assigned to that number at this point in time today. And that was a change that was made about 8 months ago, if that's fair, a year ago.
Yeah. Maybe if I can just jump in. We did use the GCMS user ID that were inactive, as you're saying, Deputy, but, sorry. But then what we're doing is that we're making sure that we're running the queries on a regular basis now, so then we don't have those cases. So if there's anything left in the system, we've developed queries to make sure that we pull them out and we take action on them. So we do have a bit of management of how we're assigning files in the system, but we're taking measures not to forget files, if that's your question.
Thank you. And that is the time. Turning now to Ms. Khalid. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Thank you, Ms. Hogan, for a really good report. I think it's important for us to realize the challenges that we go through, and with IRCC, oftentimes, and again, my own constituency office being an example, where we become the last resort for people to come to try to resolve their issues. In my own constituency office, I have at least 300 families that are waiting for decisions on files that have become now backlogged, I would say, in the system. And I'll take this opportunity also to give big shout out to my team in my office, to Christina especially, who does a lot of the work in my constituency office with that respect. And one of the big challenges that we hear from our constituents that is addressed in this report as well, is that, with processing times, some applications that are very similar to each other will get processed within 20 months, others will go on for years and years and years, and some will get processed within 6 months. So I'm wondering if you can help me understand a little bit about how these applications that are so similar are prioritized, and why is that discrepancy there?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that part of the, perhaps some of the discrepancies in terms of how that can be explained. We have, for the permanent residency programs, we have a system of point system based on express entry. And I think that over the last year, we are in a position now, more than we have been in the past, to actually do targeted draws around specific skill sets that the country may need. So health, human resources, STEM, skilled workers in some of the construction trades. So as a result of that, there's a point allocation system for permanent residency, and someone may be drawn out faster as a result of the skill sets that they can bring to the country, which could explain discrepancies. And I would also note that we work very closely with our security partners, and at times what may appear to be a very similar case application can in fact be very different in the context of the information provided by the client. And so it is hard to determine the measure between the two.
I appreciate you said that, because oftentimes when we call in to find out what the challenges are, or the constituent will call to try to get to the bottom of why their application is not moving forward, there's a major lack of transparency. A lack of information, and that often leads to people, filing for ATIPs to just get that basic information. Why can't we provide better information to people as their files are ongoing? If you're saying, discrepancies are based on what type of jobs we're looking for, what type of resources we're looking for, why can't we tell that to these really frustrated people that are waiting months and years for some kind of closure in their applications?
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. I would agree with you entirely in the context of when people are unsure about their file, they'll call the client center, they'll email someone, they'll email their MP. They may file an APTIP. They may, so it actually creates a lot more stress in the system overall. So how we've attempted to address that is obviously trying to improve the client center and the call center experience in particular, trying to improve the backlog of the web forms that existed during COVID, and actually launching status trackers for people to be able to go online and take a look at where their application stands in the system. So we've launched that for family class application, citizenship, express entry applications, TRV, study permit, and work permit. And what we're hopeful is that when people can go online and see the status, they will be hopefully aware of where they stand. Now, it does cause sometimes concern where someone will say, I've gone into my portal, I'm still in this phase. Can you explain why I'm still in this phase? But at least it's the beginning of using digital technologies to be able to track in real time for clients to access their information.
Digital technologies. Now, I do understand that artificial intelligence is now being used more and more to process applications. How does that play in with recommendation 9.36, especially with respect to refugee programs and the anti-racism strategy with how applications are processed?
Yeah, thank you. And I think it is, we do have to utilize the technologies. So for instance, for the call center, we've adopted like a robotic processing so that the triaging of documents that come in are not actually triaged manually. They're actually set up in a system so an officer who's looking at the case will have all of the documents uploaded in one place versus going to grab them in the various locations they may be. So using automation in that standpoint is helpful. I think in the context of the AG report, what I would say is that what we try to do is there are some cases that are more complex than others. That is the nature of the immigration system. And so what our hope is, and I think what we need to do a better job of is reporting against it, is that by using automation to triage the processing, we make it easier for officers to review the files that they're reviewing. And for those of them that are more straightforward applications, then the benefit would be that application is faster, but it can also benefit the others in the system that are more complex cases because we have more people allocated to doing those files if we're using automation technologies to help on the more straightforward ones. I think where the AG's report is helpful to us is she indicated, her team indicated that we needed to actually explain and report on how do all cases, all people benefit from automation, and not only those that fall into the automation categories. And I think what I would say is because of the resource allocation distribution that we can do, it's a benefit to all clients. We just need to demonstrate that clearly.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant, c'est Madame Sécla-Dengagé. Vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes.
Madame Gagné, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. And thanks to the witnesses for their appearance this morning. From the OAG, of course, Ms. Hogan, a very interesting report, as usual. And if we were to summarize the situation, as you've noticed, Madam Auditor General, the programs in immigration, very slow processing times. It's quite some backlog. And we have to ensure somehow that we can shorten these delays in order to welcome those people who chose Canada or Quebec as their host country. What we've heard from most people that met us, that everything's going forward, everything is proceeding, there is improvement. Now, I see a major problem here. Currently, we're receiving a certain number of almost 500,000, and the targets will stay at that level, about 500,000 for the next few years. However, it seems that the department cannot process these in a reasonable period of time. Ms. Fox, how do you think you're going to balance these two, a policy, an immigration policy, which is relatively ambitious, and a department which has not succeeded in processing all the applications? Have you developed the tools? Are you going to receive and use these tools? According to the OAG report, automation and technical improvements have not been appropriately used. So how are you going to resolve these issues? Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the question. Well, I think it's important to note that for our annual departmental plan, we have met our targets for the implementation of an immigration plan. Last year, we reached our target, and this year we are, for this period in the year, we're quite confident that we will reach a target this year. The department has accomplished the results for the PR group on the annual basis. There's always a balance to be made between economic issues, family reunification programs, and humanitarian issues. So we have to try to balance these categories given the international situations and occurrences outside of Canada. But based on the report and the plan tabled in the House, we have improved our permanent residency programs. Where we're having difficulties, of course, is the TR group, the temporary residents. We've seen a huge increase on that side, and this has impacts on the PR program. But nonetheless, we have met our targets for the PRs. However, you did notice where the pressure is on the temporary residence requests. If we take a look at the closure at Roxanne, for example, Roxham Road, this has created a bottleneck. And then the tourist visas went up in number incredibly. Refugees were coming in looking for temporary travel visas. So the pressure continues. Has that been communicated to the minister that there was a lot of pressure going on because of the change of categories? They were looking for permanent residency. Well, about 30% of individuals who receive or granted the PR acceptance are already in Canada. Now, where the pressure is in the system is with the influx of students, temporary foreign workers, and we see an increase, of course, a quantitative increase, and we have to perhaps readapt our tools for those in particular. For refugees seeking asylum, this is not unique to Canada. There's 110 displaced persons throughout the world. The Americans see 2.2 million currently at the borders. Yes, we know there's a heck of a lot of problems everywhere in the world and a lot of displaced peoples. But here, if we accept so many refugees, and we closed Roxham Road, and we give tourist visas to people who are obviously come here to be as refugees, and it takes 4 years to process. You have to slow down the issuance of PR certification or change how we deal with these various groups. Those seeking refuge are treated slightly apart from the immigration per se. Those who come here seeking asylum doesn't quite mesh with permanent residency. There are mechanisms, however, that we deal with all of these requests. But, as I said, the PR processing on an annualized basis, the targets have been met. Well, thank you very much. Monsieur Desjardins.
Very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for also being present, especially the Auditor General for this important report. Oftentimes when I deal with this particular related to immigration, refugees, and Canadian citizenship, similar to that of Indigenous Services Canada and similar to that of Crown Indigenous Relations. They're often categorized with disappointment, anger, and frustration. This ministry in particular is famous across the country, particularly for those who need the service most, for being a ministry of delay, a ministry of mismanagement, and a ministry of systemic racism. You failed to make mention of what was a very important call and remarks by the Auditor General this morning related to systemic racism in the service and ways that the anti-racism strategy can be implemented in a way that's concrete, but also garnishes trust given the tremendous fact this ministry continues to harm to those persons in my community and across the country. It's no secret that throughout this very difficult time, especially during the pandemic, there were real people who had to actually pick up these files. In the absence of IRCC doing that work, we had real people that had to do this work, had to take phone calls from people, that had to listen to them in their time of need. And they're a secret public service that no one ever talks about. And that's the people like Christine, that's the people like Elias, who's from my office here. He came from Edmonton because how important this work is. He deals with hundreds of these folks, a former refugee himself. He knows this system. He knows how painful the system is. He knows how violent this system can be and how much change is truly required. To make the commitments made in our treaties between where I'm from, Treaty 6, this is a matter of treaty implementation when we agreed that Canada would have jurisdiction over settlement, that they wouldn't be doing the kind of settlement processes that they are today, that leave families worse off at times than the time they came, leave them in limbo wondering where their children are going to be. To my colleagues, this is families, real people. And it's really difficult for me to try to humanize these systems at times because we talk about people as if they're numbers or they're people in a queue or people in a line, but these are real families. Kids by themselves. I dealt with a case in my office, Elias and I, where a 12-year-old girl was by herself overseas. These are unacceptable. Simply unacceptable, especially the fact that we have a government that's committed to an anti-racist strategy that in itself has not committed to understanding how those that can be implicated in their own systems. So my question will be specifically on what the Auditor General has mentioned in her remarks. And I'll quote it. She says, the department committed to addressing systemic barriers to applications under its anti-racism strategy. However, it had yet to take any steps to collect demographic information about applicants and monitor and correct disparities in processing applications. This is critical to identifying and removing systemic barriers across government programs. To the Deputy Minister, you know, you've served this government for a long time. Your service to this government far predates, in some ways, the anti-racist strategy. How do you find yourself as a deputy minister for many departments with the reality that the anti-racist strategy exists, and you see a report like this that suggests these barriers still exist? What are your words to those families that have had to endure these barriers, that have had to suffer these barriers, and what is your commitment to actually addressing the systemic barriers in a real way that demonstrates you understand what racism is? Because trust has been lost. Now the work of rebuilding that trust is far harder to get to where we need to be if we don't have it. So what is your commitment to those people that, in particular, when they find themselves in applications, particularly the Sub-Saharan office, where they find barriers like this very consistently? And what are your words for those families that are in my office and across the country's offices that continue waiting and are told to have trust in a system that our Auditor General has found to be non-compliant with our anti-racist strategy? Please.
I think I would answer that in kind of 3 or 4 parts. I think the first part I would say is I take pride in seeing what IRCC staff do every single day to support people. And I think it is important for the committee to know.
I also agree with those members and Deputy Minister. This is about you.
Yeah,
and I know you're trying to evade the question.
I'm not evading the question.
And I want to be very specific, Madam Fox. Your commitment, not your staff's commitment, not the good work of our public service that struggles with this file every single. I've talked to your public servants.
Yeah.
They're struggling.
Yeah.
How difficult this work is. They need to know that their deputy minister understands what they're going through, not by saying thank you, but by acknowledging that these systems are real, that racism is real, and that you understand racism is real. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do understand it.
I just
And
want to
it-
interrupt just for 1 second, Ms. Fox. So just so you know, like you've got about 30 seconds. So I just flagged that. It's your time. You can use it however you like. But I just want
Chair.
you to know that if you do want an answer, you need to allow some time. But
Thank you, Chair.
as
And I
said
understand we have many rounds as well.
You can probe as much as you like. So I'm going to
Thank you.
The floor is yours, Ms. Fox. Thank you.
So as Deputy Minister of IRCC, former Deputy Minister of ISK, and mother of 2 girls, I am absolutely committed to anti-racism work. I empower my team to challenge ourselves on how the policies we develop have an impact on people. And I look at specific case studies. I empower people to bring them to me, data around Nigerian students versus India students, looking at the policies and programs that we have in place, how our decisions around Afghanistan and Ukraine have an impact on how we respond in other places in the world. So what would I say in terms of my own personal commitment is that I not only encourage our conversations between employees, I support the various networks that exist within my organization. I empower them through decisions that I make to give them a voice at the highest table of our department.
But the Auditor General says you haven't made it. You haven't hit the point.
Well, on the
the facts and what you're saying are not real.
And Ms.
we'll
Fox,
follow up with this in the
I'm going to
next
have to
round.
call it right there, but I know Mr. Desjardins will have another opportunity, and we will hear from you at that point. Turning now to Mr. Kimmick. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'allais juste continuer la question de...
Thank you. I'd like to follow on with this question to Ms. Kennedy. For permanent residents, what percentage of that group were in fact temporary workers who wanted to be classified as permanent? About 30% over the last few years. There might be some changes in the years to come, but this is the average now. Can you get us some specific statistics for the last 3 years? The percentage of people who have transferred or converted from temporary to permanent? Yes. Okay, I'll get back to my previous questions for yourself and Ms. Dorion. Where are the decisions taken? At the DM level, ADM, or lower still? As a senior ADM, I receive it in a regular way, and I get these reports on a regular basis. I follow this very faithfully. If we see that some are stuck somewhere, and how often do you revise it? Monthly. Could we have an example of that? Well, yes. So we'll have to redact a few names, if you will, but we'll do that. Yes, we understood. That's fine.
Back to the management action plan. In one of the reports, it talks about developing a pilot plan to test methodology, gain insights about the best ways to collect, analyze, and use race-based and ethno-cultural data. Will self-identified religious affiliation also be part of this analysis and the response?
So I think that we're still developing what kind of that will look like. What we did back in 2022 is we went out to survey some of our clients, first of all, to see how many of them would be willing to self-identify with their racial and ethnic identity. In that case, 91% were open to sharing their data. So the work that we have ahead of us is what type of data should we be collecting? How can we work with StatsCan to ensure that we've got the right methodologies, that we've got, and I think it'll be very important for us as we look at this work. How do we have sort of, these are sometimes privacy intrusive activities. How do we put the right safeguards in place to protect not only the data, but how the data is used, and sort of making sure we've got sort of an ethical and a privacy frame to that. We would be, I think that I wouldn't comment on what will be in and out at the end of the day. That work is still being done, but we take note of your comment.
Did you ask your clients and stakeholders and all the other people whether they would be whether they think that religious affiliation should be tracked by your department.
I think the only question that we asked so far was racial and ethnic, but we could go back and look at, surveying, because we're going to do more surveying of our clients. That could be a question that we add to the
So
survey.
I ask because the Citizenship and Immigration Committee has repeatedly asked for religious affiliation to be tracked, because that is one of the main ways of persecution overseas.
Yes.
And it's a source of persecution against people. Lots of people have names that basically identify what the religious affiliation will be. And I'm thinking of Armenians in the Middle East, very easily identifiable group.
Yeah.
But your department continues to insist they don't collect the data. Fine, I understand it. But this action plan, final completion date says April 1st, 2025. So you have lots of time to consider
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
So I believe that you should go back and ask whether religious affiliation should be tracked. It is one of the main reasons that people are persecuted all over the world. Different religions are persecuted in different majority countries, and there are always minority religious affiliations. I'm thinking of Pakistan as another example, where minority religious communities like the Sikhs are persecuted as well, but so are the Ahmadiyas. They're also persecuted. And I meet with many of these client stakeholder groups, and I'm sure if you prompted them, I'm just surprised that your department didn't ask the question. I'm just wondering why that is.
It's a survey where we started with kind of phases of work that we would go out with, so we can see what kind of the next steps are. But I think there's also a worry probably in the system around clients wanting to share that type of information and being very worried about what would happen if they were to share. So I think it is worth us going out and being very specific to get that data and get people's comfort level, because clearly with the data we have, 91, we're comfortable sharing the other pieces of the data.
So, Deputy Minister, I'm going to ask you, in Budget 2023, the IRPA was amended to clarify that the minister could give instructions regarding processing of sponsorship applications. That's not enforced yet, is that correct?
So I think here's what I would say. For the privately sponsored refugees, I completely acknowledge that right now the wait time is very high. And I think that this is...
I'm just asking whether that system is in place. Can the minister issue instructions?
He can issue instructions.
Right
I
now?
believe everything... I'd have to check, actually.
intake.
Yeah, for PSR intake.
Yeah, we have the legislative power to do it, but we're working on defining and working the details out. So that's coming up, but not in effect yet.
And that is the time, I'm afraid, and a little over. Turning now to Ms. Shanahan, you have the floor
Merci
for 5
beaucoup.
minutes.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le
C'est bien ça?
Président.
Je suis correct?
Oui,
Ok.
juste
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes. I'd like, first of all, to thank Ms. Hogan for a very important report, as my colleagues were mentioning before. We are very involved in individual offices for our electors, the people we represent, on these files. I'd like to acknowledge those in my writing where we find, while the Roxham Road is in my writing, well known, famous or notorious, but in any case, the mayor and all the surrounding municipalities have worked for years to ensure that there was a humanitarian approach to their arrival, and as efficient as possible, of course. But we're pleased to see that, things have calmed down on Roxham Road. And we have a lot more control on the arrival of asylum seekers. Ms. Fox, you mentioned that the treatment, the processing is different from PRTR and refugees. So what approach do you have now? How do you handle these requests at this time, particularly those who are entering through Quebec? Thank you. You're absolutely right. Asylum seekers have been more regularized. Roxham was an informal or non-standard, so we added a few protocols such that people arrive at regular ports of entry, airport, seaport. On the Quebec side, IRCC has well, it's somewhat similar to the processes that we had in COVID period. We reserve hotels in order to lodge temporarily individuals who are in extreme vulnerable situation. We've arrived at agreements with Quebec to ensure that people have a place to stay. In Ontario, we're working not only with the province, but also with the municipalities. Niagara Falls, Cornwall, Mississauga, to develop a reception center. Together with the municipalities, people can approach that reception center, make their application as refugees, have access to medical assistance or health services and other services that they might require, and then work with the province to ensure that we can do some matching. It's true that we have a higher number of volume than prior. So this is our support in partnership with the municipalities. Work permits, for example, are extremely important. We have a public paucity last November 2022 so that we could do more work in advance to have it preset when they arrive. People can get a work permit now between 5 to 30 days, depending on their state of health, to work. I've worked very closely with the churches, the ecumenical groups in the Toronto area, where there was a lot of pressure to work with volunteers to assist people from these various congregations to move into federal lodging. Particularly in the winter, we have to be very careful. Every weekend, we have a plan developed how we're going to develop if we receive a large number of arrivals. From the departmental point of view, we can manage the crisis, making sure people are housed and treated humanely, and in the long term, to continue to make efficiencies into the system for the general purpose of arrival. Okay. We often receive requests for family reunification. Can you talk to us a little bit about the agreement you may have with Quebec on that? Yes, certainly. But for those chapters of the OAG report on that subject, I think the arrival of families, the timelines are maybe 20 months. That's been reduced to 13 months. So we've speeded up the process, reduced the delay times. In Canada, we were at 12 months, and now it's 10 months. So we have made improvements there. With the agreement with Quebec, it's a little bit more complex because family reunification takes a bit more time than in other provinces, because their threshold of immigration is set by the province. Once they've arrived to that ceiling, the excess over the line, if you will, have to wait longer. But we're still working on family reunification and humanitarian cases. If we take a look at our website, outside of Quebec, the processing time is faster than in Quebec. Thank you very much, Madame Gagné. Thank you. It's a yes or no question, Madame Fox. I've asked it prior, but I didn't have a conclusive answer. As Deputy Minister, do you consider that the department, IRCC, have the necessary means, financial resources, human resources, to process, to manage 500,000 individuals per year? Your opinion? It's not. I can't answer that with a yes or no, but well, you either have the means or you don't. We have significant funding to allow us to attain and achieve the goals of the department. But various population groups represent different complexities. If we have 1.2 million requests, if it's an economic refugee or economic applicant, it's different than if it's a PR or a TR or a foreign worker. So it's very difficult for me to tell you that, do you have the necessary resources to manage the immigration plan, Canada's immigration plan? My answer would be yes. Yes, what's been tabled in the House, we can say yes. If we see a certain explosion of requests for visits to Canada, that would change my answer. So I find it very difficult to give you a non-conditional yes or no. We are, in fact, resourced sufficiently. That's only one of your responsibilities. Yes, yes, exactly. Well, students, for example, temporary workers, we meet the targets for the demand. But if we have 300 or 400,000 next year, wow. Well, it won't be 400,000 next year. It's fairly constant. Students wanting to come and study from Africa in particular, they come to Quebec. They're French speaking and they go to our French language institutions. How do you deal with that? Well, there has been an enormous increase in that category, particularly. In 2019, we were about 300,000, and now we're 5,000. We have changed the system for student applicants. We check all the documentations on Fridays. We try to integrate and as to Francophone African students, I agree with you completely. We have to increase more. But double intent is also an issue here. The refusal rate is often higher there. And there are cases of fraud throughout the country, here and there. And we have to do more to accept more foreign students in Canada. Mr. Desjardins, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Now I'd like to turn to the Deputy Minister. I know you're tasked with a very difficult job, one that consistently demands that you provide independent evidence to this committee and independent recommendations to better assist our public service. Oftentimes, in my short time in this place, you have made very clear that these systems have harmed people and that you've reported those harms. And last month, I actually asked you in relation to when you tabled the racism in the workplace audit directly related to IRCC. We found that employees of IRCC themselves have demonstrated or submitted evidence to you that they themselves believe racism exists in their processing of applications. And I'll quote your answer when I asked you that question last month. You said, "I'll tell you that the Deputy Minister has acknowledged that systemic discrimination exists in her organization. In fact, a recent internal audit that was published on the website highlights that employees are raising discriminatory practices in the processing of applications. We found that there really are differential outcomes, but the organization was not analyzing their outcomes in that way. They weren't looking at the results based on race or country. We did that for them in the audit. We made recommendations for them to better understand that." Ms. Hogan, do you think that these recommendations will find earnest reception and change and transformation that's needed to make sure that systemic racism is truly combated in this country? And I speak to my experiential evidence in this committee. We've seen many Indigenous Service Canada reports that go decades into unchanging systemic racism. Do you have confidence that your recommendations are enough to see that IRCC truly takes seriously the issue of systemic racism, when in fact the Deputy Minister just today didn't even acknowledge it in her statement?
I mean, it's a large question. Do I think the federal public service will address this? I think there's a lot of goodwill towards this, and I've worked on other audits with the Deputy Minister Fox, and I believe that she's committed to it. We saw the action plan that the department's put forward here. They're committing to start to gather that data. I guess my concern is that this commitment came under their EDI plan, and there's been very little activity till now. The deadline is in 2025, 2026. It's a long time, but that's a place to start. You need to first acknowledge that there are biases and there are unintended consequences that are happening in the system. Gather the data to figure out how to break those down. And I guess what I often don't see, and what I didn't see here, was that there was an acknowledgement that that needed to happen. It's in the action plan that was submitted to this committee. It's just a long way out in my mind, a long way for people to continue to wait to see some changes in the process that will hopefully have a concrete impact on discriminatory practice.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Turning now to Mr. Redikoff. Good to see you, and you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Hogan, it's good to see you again. I think I saw you at Environment Committee a few years ago, but you might be aware that at the Immigration Committee, we recently concluded a study on backlogs at the Immigration Department, and so this audit's very timely. It also lines up well, I think, with what Conservatives have been saying and where we stand on this issue. I'm concerned about Exhibit 9.7. It shows some of the decreases in inventory from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, but what it shows that's disturbing to me is the increase in processing or increase in the age of the inventory, particularly at the end of the year. It indicates to me that the department's they're not following a first in, first out type of system, because the ending inventory's age is quite a bit higher. And you did actually in paragraph 920 say that this is contrary to operating principle. So my question to you is why is there no recommendation in the report dealing with this?
Well, because I acknowledge that the first in, first out principle is an operating principle. It's a great one, but at times just can't function. So if I give you an example, if an application that comes in and what's missing is a key immigration document, you can request it and then move on to the next file. If you have to wait for that document to come in, then all subsequent files are delayed, needlessly waiting for that file. So there needs to be a bit of a balance. But what we found was that operational pressures to meet the targets, the immigration level targets, drove a behavior where easy to process applications were sometimes treated faster, which meant that and we saw that by analyzing the age of what was sitting in the backlog.
Right, and I guess that's directly my point, because I understand what you're saying, but this is a significant increase in age. And so I would have thought that you would have directed the department, to investigate this, to try to fix that problem or to manage it. So I guess my further question is, your auditors would have had discussions with the department in this. Were there discussions about not putting recommendation in there, or was there any political interference in that?
No one interferes with our audits and our recommendations. We do obviously have a conversation with the department and officials around what makes sense in the context, what can be implemented, and at times when they disagree with us, it's because we held firm that we didn't see the outcome that we wanted to achieve through a different path. I think we have made recommendations here that they need to better analyze their backlog along many lines, along race, along country of citizenship, country of ethnicity, the age. All of that sort of analysis needs to be better done to understand why. And some of it has to do with the office that an application is sent to process. So just that basic element of understanding the capacity in your offices and redirecting would have an impact on this. And we encourage the department to do that with our recommendations.
Ms. Fox, on the same point, Minister Fraser introduced an $82 million bump up to the budget specifically to deal with to process new applications. Is that not politically stating we want you to ignore old applications, work on new ones?
No, we thank you for the question. I think the way that we've tried to manage it is there's a flow of work that needs to be sort of managed, whether it's complex cases, new cases, aged inventory, and what we try to do is parse out between the teams that we have, and we have had funding to increase our processing capacity quite significantly. So it's almost like there's kind of task teams that are dedicated to kind of the kind of routine, less complex cases, and the ones that are more complex, which usually are the aged inventory, a separate team kind of dedicated to that. And I think that the global processing allows us to spread that work around.
But wouldn't you agree that for the minister to say, I want to give you this money to focus on these simpler, easier cases and not focus so much on the complicated, older cases, is that not political direction to focus on recent cases?
I think that all of the cases that we received, we got direction to treat as quickly as possible, and we were resourced in order to deal with both the new incoming to try to get back to service standard for those applying into the system today, and also resources to deal with the backlog.
And how's that worked out? Like we still see these kinds of numbers with massive wait times. We deal with this in our office all the time. People that have been waiting for years, literally years, and they have their friends who have come in sooner. They get their applications processed sooner. And I believe that the minister has directed it this way, and the auditors found this too. I was disappointed there was no recommendation to deal with the fact that the average ages of these cases is so long. I mean, this is to me, as an MP, in the things that I see every day in my office, this is, and I'm sure all of us see this is a critical issue, and this can't go on. These old cases have to be dealt with, and if they're not, it puts pain and pressure on real people. These aren't files. These aren't things sitting on a desk. These are actually people. And
Ms. Fox, do you have a brief response to that? I do have to cut you off, Mr. Renikoff. You might not. That was more of a statement. I think the question. Oh, pardon me, Ms. Hogan. I should
It's
say.
okay. If I could add, I would send the member, Mr. Chair, to recommendation 943, where we actually recommend to the department to prioritize some of the older backlogged files. And so while we didn't use the first in principle, we recommended that they understand it and prioritize those older files. So that recommendation is there.
Thank you very much. Apologies about that. Turn now to Ms. Yip. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Hogan, I was glad to hear that because when I look at my constituency staff and the backlogs and so forth, it's a lot, and it's also distressing to them as well, having to explain to the constituents and so forth. It takes its toll on our staff as well. We've talked a lot about the anti-racism strategy. This is directed to Ms. Fox, but I haven't quite heard what are the actual steps taken to address the systemic barriers to applicants under its anti-racism strategy. What are we doing now? What are some of the concrete plans? And I know in the action plan it's like far into the future, but what are we doing about it now?
So I think, just to be clear to the committee members, I think that I have said previously, and I have said this to within my my organization and outside my organization, that we absolutely acknowledge that there is systemic racism within the department. And yes, I joined a long time ago when those conversations were not taking place. But I think it is absolutely essential that as a leader in an organization, we ensure that those conversations take place and that we tackle them head on. I think what I would say in terms of what are some of the concrete things that we're doing now, I think that looking at IRCC's footprint around the world and choices around where we allocate resources is very important. I think there's huge benefit to global processing. And I think that in the current context of the situation in India, we have been very much our services were less impacted as a result of the fact that we were able to move work, where I think 89% of the caseload coming from India was managed outside New Delhi. And so that gave us that flexibility. But I think that having a footprint on the ground in certain places needs to be improved. And I think sub-Saharan Africa is absolutely one of those examples. So we used to have just under, I think, between 35 and 40 staff. We're now, as of December 2023, Canada-based staff in certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We're at 54 people. We've engaged 22 locally engaged decision makers, so they are part of our decision-making process. And so that means an increase of about 20 people on the ground, Canadian-based staff, and we are looking to increase that even more. So I think that is a way to have a bit more sort of migration diplomacy, intelligence on the ground, sensitivity to issues that maybe would not necessarily be akin to the issues that someone in another location may face. And so I think that is one example of how we're trying to address and make change.
So that's good to hear about sub-Saharan Africa, but what about other places and
We've
resources?
got, absolutely.
And how is the department juggling that?
Yep,
To
we
make
are.
sure resources are fair across the board.
And those are, there are always choices that we need to make around sort of what is the work that we do in terms of domestic processing, what is our footprint internationally, and I think that we've got, and we could absolutely provide to the committee kind of our footprint around the world and what that looks like. It's got to be cognizant of some of our objectives around l'immigration francophone, par exemple. On a des objectifs et des cibles assez élevés pour les années.
We have high ambitions for the sub-Saharan group. Where we are operating in the world has a very big impact on feasibility. We're taking a look at African strategies, Indo-Pacific strategies, and we're trying to make sure that there's improvements and more efficiency in all regions.
I was looking at this graph in the report on refugee, economic, and family class. Why does it take longer to process the economic class rather than the family class, especially if there are certain skill sets that are really needed?
I think I would answer this one by saying that when you look at the graph and all the data in the report, that's from 2022. So we were just at the end of the pandemic. We accumulated large backlogs of applications during the pandemics in certain categories where we have clients coming more frequently from overseas. We couldn't process them during COVID. The borders were closed. So if you look at the stats that you have in the report, for example, the federal iSkills or the federal trade, we were at 32 months of processing at December 2022 because we couldn't process those people during COVID. But we do have intake control, so we made sure that we're controlling the intake. And when we look at that today, we're at 5 months of processing time. So that's just, the report shows the end tail of what COVID did to us by accumulating inventories we couldn't process, basically.
Thank you. That is the time. I'm going down to Mr. McCauley. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Welcome back, A.G. Hogan and Ms. Fox and Ms. Dorian. Welcome. A couple of quick questions, probably for Ms. Fox. The Service Fees Act, where it requires remissions, rebates to people who serve where we haven't met their service standards, that was suspended over COVID, I understand. Has that been reestablished? And if so, when? If not, why not?
So I think for the Passport Service Fee Act, I think...
I'm not referring to Passport, but for
I'd have to
immigration.
check which ones of our service fees have a reimbursement attached to them. So I can get that information to the committee, but I don't have it here.
Have we restarted the remission program, or is it still suspended?
Yeah. I'll have to come back. I don't have the answer on
I'm
me.
sorry, how do you not know? This is a major requirement for your department. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be rude, but this is a major thing. It was suspended during COVID. COVID's been over a year. How do you not know as Deputy Minister whether we've reestablished?
I think what I'm saying is we've reestablished the remission order, but I don't have the breakdown of how many programs it applies to.
Could you provide us when it was restarted and how many we've processed?
Yeah.
And if the ones that were applied during the COVID, during the suspension, if there's just a hard no on those, and we're not going to refund those at all?
Well, if the remission order was suspended at the time of the delay, then no, there would not be reimbursement.
I'm looking at the GC info base, just about your staffing levels. I understand there was a surge and delays, but there was a 79% increase in your budget from 2018 to 2022, a 39% increase in staffing from 2017 to 2021. Like, how do we have these massive backlogs with a 79% increase in funding and almost a 40% increase in staffing?
Well, I think my answer to that would be demand. Demand has grown exponentially. And so we have more staff and more funding to deliver on a broader program and a greater program.
When you say demand, can you break out the demand for us? Like, is it demand from the PR level, demand from other levels is up 40%?
Yeah, so I think I can...
Is there a straight line between increase in demand and an increase needed in staffing?
I can definitely give you a picture of the increases. So I think as you see in the permanent residency program, the increases in the levels plan are quite. You've got the levels increases from sort of over the last 10 years. I can tell you that just even in the call center, we saw last year, so email inquiries, phone inquiries, we saw 10.6 million inquiries, and that's compared to 4.6 in 2018. So you see a doubling of inquiries into the call center. So I think in every line of business.
For continual increase then in staffing?
Pardon me?
Do you foresee a continual need for an increase in staffing then?
I think what I would say is we make our case every year through the budget cycle of what we need to deliver on the government's objectives. And I think that we articulated that for this year's levels plan for the PR program. I think that we have grown as an organization, and I think we need to stabilize that growth and execute on the priorities of the department. So I'm not going to say we're never going to increase. If there was a new demand for a new activity, then I wouldn't want to limit ourselves from making that request. But I think that we've...
Are you recording productivity levels comparing in office versus at home? And can you share those with the committee, please?
Yes, we are. We definitely have productivity levels, both in terms of domestic staff, staff abroad, complex cases,
I'm thinking
regular
more
cases.
about staff here in Canada working from home.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can definitely provide that. And it's important to note that not all processing staff are working from home. Some are in the office, but we can definitely provide that.
Yeah, do so. What would you, if you look at the report...
Very briefly, Mr. McCauley, please.
Just ask, what's the low-hanging fruit from the report that we can get to right away?
One of the portals, which is being launched December 20th. So definitely that's one that we can get out right away.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Going now to Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in your report, it's indicated that there are some instances in which the factors that lead to processing delays are outside of the control of our IRCC. For example, when refugee applicants reside outside of their countries of citizenship and the conditions in those countries where they reside affect the processing of their applications. Can you expand on that and what measures you're taking to mitigate the factors that are outside of your control?
Thank you very much for the question. That's probably one of the most challenging things to manage. So I think that when you look at country of origin, and I think I'll use an example as part of my answer. If we have a refugee from Somalia, and that refugee is in a camp in Kenya versus a Somalian refugee who is in a camp in Uganda, the processing time will change. Because the exit permits in one country may be 30 days, it may be 5 days in another country, it could be 60 days in a different country. And so the treatment of the Somalian refugee, the experience of that person with our system would be very different depending on where they were. The second factor is around, there are very important things that the department needs to do in terms of interviewing refugee applicants, ensuring biometrics, ensuring medical exams, and sometimes access to panel physicians in certain parts of the country would be more challenging. And so how do we try to mitigate that? We work very closely with the UNHCR. We work very closely with the International Organization for Migration. And we're trying to actually expand our partnerships to get to people that are sometimes harder to get to. Rainbow Railroad is a great example of an organization that helped us out tremendously in Afghanistan. We now have an agreement with them as a referral partner, which allows us to do some work that we weren't able to do before. But it is really important that as we look at refugee processing, the country or the location of the individual sometimes has a more material impact than the country of origin.
Thank you for clarifying that. So building on that, the report recommends that IRCC improves the consistency of application processing times across its offices. The report states that certain regional offices have higher workloads than other offices. So what is the plan to address the regional backlogs and disparities in these regional processing times for all applications, especially with respect to refugee applications?
So I think it's twofold. I think one, it's relying on some of the global processing improvements that we made coming out of COVID that we can rely on to try to help us get through that. And I think the second is increasing our capacity in different parts of the world to try to have more on the ground impact. And so it's a combination of those two things that I think will help us address some of the recommendations from the Auditor General.
Okay, and also, so you have alluded before, obviously, there was a lot of challenges in your department presented by COVID and not being able to allow people into the country. So that being said, did it present any opportunities for your department?
Yes, absolutely. I think that when we were forced to do and think about things differently, we were able to pivot and go to more digital applications. And citizenship is a good example of transforming into a fully digital process within 10 months versus probably what it would have taken longer had it been done outside the COVID period. I think that the global processing is another real kind of impact of how we do our workload. I think in the past, if your paper application came in through the Paris office, you were sort of at the mercy of how busy that office was. Now with global applications, we can actually, and digital applications, we can do triaging a little bit more. So I think we're definitely not done on the modernization piece. I think there's a lot of work that we can do to improve our systems, and we have investments to do that. But I think things like the trackers to get status updates, the portals that have been launched, the global processing, the citizenship online to allow people to become Canadian citizens when they actually couldn't gather in person. These are all, I think, good examples of flexibilities and things we learned from COVID.
Okay, so you have implemented the automated decision-making process, but there's some concerns with that, with some saying that these tools make decisions without oversight from IRCC officers. So can you clarify how the automated decision-making tools are being used and how you're getting around that, you don't have officers overseeing this now?
So at the end of the day, every single decision is made by an officer, and I think that has to be clear for the committee. That is how the legislation works. I think where the automated tools help us is some of the triaging to make the decision easier for the individual officer. So to use an example from the temporary resident visa line, as an officer reviews a number of visitor visas, if there is a pre-population of, this person has traveled to Canada before, this person has, whatever criteria we set, then at least it kind of triages some of that initial information to make the decision easier and more straightforward for the officer. Just to give you an example of another sort of how robotics have helped us, we had a big backlog in web form inquiries. I think we were at around 275,000 in backlog back in 2022 of people that had sent in web forms. With the use of robotics, we were able to triage that, make decisions, answer questions. We're now down to about 60,000 of those. So again, I'm not saying that the work is complete. There's a lot of work to be done, but these tools help us.
Thank you very much. Madame Séclair, encore, et je vais essayer de, vous aurez 7 opportunités, puis encore une autre après. Alors,
You have 2 minutes. I'd like to go back to an important issue in Quebec. Francophone African students, when we examine the numbers, it's problematic for the very same number of demands or requests for study visas for students. The refusal rate is twice for Francophone students or applicants and Anglophone. 72% of those accepted in Quebecois universities are refused a study visa. You've recognized or acknowledged that in 22 there was a systemic racist problem or racism problem within the department. What has been done to try to attenuate that? Well, the refusal rate has been improved. It's less. The acceptance rate is much higher than what it was before. You have numbers? The approval rate, acceptance rate for Francophone Africans went from 27% in 2019 to 36% currently. So that's a 10% increase almost. Yes, but you're still refusing 2/3 of the demand of the requests of francophone applicants. So that's huge, and it's much higher than anglophone applicants. Well, double intent is one factor. We're going to have to take a hard decision to see what we can do to address that. A lot of it is due to that double intent. Also, the financial aspect. There are impacts on the data, which I'm examining quite closely. There's a higher rate of fraud coming from African countries. Well, overall, not just students. And the agent will perhaps see that fraud and reject the application on that basis. So, but we do have to improve that rate. We have to get better than 36%. So if we remove that factor, double intent, I think for Quebec, for example, Quebec has noted that a lot of them go for permanent residencies. Okay, thank you.
2.5 minutes, and I am working to give you another spot after this, so if you can just keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I do want to now turn to what has been raised by several of my colleagues, which is the issue of capacity. It was mentioned by Mr. McCauley, some of the funding enhancements, and it's not lost on me that COVID was, of course, an extraordinary event to which services across the government were put into a position of deficit often, but now we're in a position where most ministries, I believe, are in a position where they've seen improvements to some of this work and have actually found best or better means of doing that work within their ministries. When it comes to capacity in particular, we have seen an audit of IRCC in previous that spoke about the lack of support for the Sub-Saharan office. You made mention about that capacity change. I welcome that capacity change. I think it's a good change for the office to see that capacity there. But something the Auditor General pointed out, which concerns me in the instance where this issue may be duplicated or could be duplicated, is understanding what information, what valuable or important or reliable information is actually important in tracking where capacity issues become an issue before it actually happens. That would be the most appropriate means to which I think a deputy minister should be well aware of in terms of being able to predict when a capacity issue could be made and to allocate resources and a plan or a process before they become families who are not reunified, which is the issue we're seeing today. What are some of the verifiable pieces of information, first to Ms. Hogan and then to Deputy Minister Fox, that you cited was lacking in the decision-making process related to capacity funding for offices?
Well, during our audit, what we found was that the department wasn't aware of the capacity of certain offices, and while they knew there might have been chronic underfunding and lack of resources in some offices, they continued to reallocate or to allocate files there based on the country of residence. So that country of residence dictates where the application goes. And we used, for example, we compared two offices, one in Tanzania and one in Rome, and found that the Tanzanian office, they have the same amount of personnel, but the Tanzanian office was receiving 5 times the workload. And there was a commitment back in 2016 by the department to do what they called activity-based or capacity-based allocation. And we just weren't seeing that happen, where they were not realizing that we can't keep sending to Tanzania, we should reallocate it other places. So that wasn't happening during our audit period, and that's an important element. That will just cause all those files that go to that office to wait longer to be processed.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. I will come back to you for another turn. Mr. McCauley, you have the floor, please, for 5.
Thanks, Chair. Ms. Fox, do you have enough I want to get back to a question about resources. I'm looking again at GC Infobase, and every year your department is lapsing 1 out of every $8 that's approved consistently. Like, what is going on that we're lapsing so much money if we've got such a spike in demand as you've stated? And is that lapsing affecting the service?
So I think first, I would agree with you that as deputy responsible, we have to pay very close attention to the money that we're spending and the money that we're lapsing. And I think that in the context of sort of some of the monies that we lapsed in previous years would have been due to at times predicting arrivals of Afghan refugees, of Ukrainian arrivals. And so when you create a program, that could be, one of the lapses.
I'm going to interrupt you. I get that, but it's consistent year after year. It's not a spike here or there. It's consistent every year that you're lapsing over 12% of your money that has been appropriated.
I think what I would say is I can speak to last year because this is my first year as the deputy here, and so I won't speak to previous lapses. But the lapses that we had can be explained by the pace of arrivals and in the context.
Would you get back to the committee on the past 5 years, what programs have been lapsed for the money that have been approved? You commented to my previous question about staffing, about you're looking to stabilize the growth. Could you expand what you mean by that?
I think what I mean by that is in the context of working through the backlog, we hired a number of people to get through that. And I think it was the right thing to do, and I think that it's led to some examples of results. But the government has also invested into modernizing our platform, and we have investment that we're working through. And what I'm hoping is that through the benefits of some of our modernization investments, we can stabilize the organization so that we can leverage those technologies and not more people.
Stabilizing the growth of the amount of full-time equivalents, or stabilizing the growth of the spending within your department? What specifically were you referring to?
I think it's about stabilizing the growth of FTEs. I think it's about looking at the organization and looking at how modernization can help us deal with the surge in volumes.
There was quite a surge in FTEs. Are they focused on the wrong areas? Like, do you have a certain amount of the growth was focused on permanent residents?
Yeah, so definitely our processing group, like our service delivery organization, did grow. I would say that's where the majority of the growth came from. And then internally, we've made some changes to our structures to allow to put resources towards things that I think are quite key to the organization's success. One example is the creation of the international crisis response sector within our department. We created an Afghan sector to deal with the Afghan crisis, and I think that we need to prepare ourselves for being better positioned to predict and to analyze or to have better line of sight on different crises. So that would be another area that I've invested in.
I'm looking at your management action plan, and one of the criticisms I always have when these plans come forward, not just yours, but every department, is we'll look at stuff years down the road. And then our Auditor General comes in and says 5 years later, 8 years later, nothing was done. There seems to be like a real lack of concrete action here. And I want to read out one specifically. Cross-training of resources and subsequent workload distribution to help maintain relevant processing knowledge, skills, and expertise will continue to take place, ensuring optimally flexibility in the workforce. Global network provides virtual region, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of word salad, but there's not a lot of concrete, we will fix this by this date. There's a lot of, we'll look at options to address a program of recommendations at this date. Why is there like a lack of concrete, we will achieve this recommendation by this date and fix it by this date?
I think the action plan does speak to specific dates, and even within the kind of overall objective, the work plan does speak to the breakdown of when we can achieve what.
It speaks to a lot more of we will present a plan by this date, but not actual achievements. Like if I read through, I don't see a lot of these that will fix the recommendations or achieve the recommendations the AG has provided.
Maybe I can jump in there just to say that we've done since the beginning of this year, and we started years before, but this year has been more active. We're taking the TR, I know we're talking PRs here, but to give capacity in some offices, we're taking more of the TR, the Temporary Resident Program application, and we're moving them into Canada. So since the
So I'm
beginning
going
of
to
the
give you
year,
an example.
Thank you very
A
much.
year from now, seek
thank you.
approval for a plan.
Mr. McCauley, the time is elapsed. Mr. Blois, you have the floor for 5 minutes,
Thank
please.
you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, thank you to you and your team. Ms. Fox, thank you as well. I don't think there's been enough. Obviously, this is a committee of scrutiny, but you came into this role in July of 2022. And I think there was a reason, because I think that there had to be some changes. We were up against it. You're an experienced deputy minister. And I want to say that I think under your leadership, things have improved. I'm sure you'll tell me there's more to be done, and I think this committee will agree with that. But I want you to know that I do think there's been a marked difference in the department over the last year or so. Since we're thanking public servants, I want to thank Tanya in my own office. She handles the casework. She was with Mr. Bryson previously and does really good work. Couple feedback I want to give you quickly. The status updates is making a difference because we are getting less calls to our MP's office because people can actually watch their application through. So the more that we can expand that out through programs would be warranted. And there is now scheduled times for MP offices to engage with officers, which helps plan MP's office's days. So two really good suggestions there. I want to ask about, this is a little bit off scope of the report, but I think it's relevant. Recognized employer pilot. I have a lot of temporary foreign workers that come to Kings Hants in the Annapolis Valley, and I would describe the initiative as we've gone half the step. We've been able to work on not having to file LMIAs where there's a clear demonstrable need for the labor, but what can IRCC do to actually make things easier for the workers who are coming from host countries who have been coming for years, in some cases decades, to slow down or basically to eliminate some of that administrative burden as quickly as you could?
Just maybe quickly, I think that the recognized employer pilots are very helpful in sort of working with employers, but also supporting those who come on a temporary basis. I think the best way to answer your question is looking at how we can provide, when a client is interested, pathways to move from temporary foreign worker to more permanent residency in Canada. And I think we, working very closely with the some businesses in New Brunswick, for instance, we were able to develop a critical worker program that has that pathway for temporary foreign workers. And I think that why I like that example is because employers, the 6 employers who are part of this, also contributed to language training. They contributed to some of the social supports, and I think that builds communities. So I think that's the example that we should try to strive for.
And I would agree with you. There are some instances in talking to workers where they can actually create better living conditions for their own family by coming. So there is some who want to come to Canada on a permanent basis. Others don't. And sometimes there's a stereotype assuming everyone wants to come to Canada. So whatever IRCC can do to, I think, match what has been done at ESDC, to expedite those approvals in terms of the actual entry into the country would be good. I want to mention Ukraine. Ms. Hogan, it wasn't mentioned in your report at all, but Ms. Fox, I assume the government's decision to allow the 3-year permit would have had some impact on processing times. Is that fair to say, like just quickly?
Absolutely. There was a decision around prioritization of arrival of Ukrainians, and that included providing work permits, study permits, income support. Yep. And so definitely that did have an impact.
I want to go, when I went through the report, there was a process chart where it talked about 5 different levels of process, and it talked about application returned when there could be a mistake or some type of information not going. And speaking, again, I don't handle the work directly. My constituent assistant, Tanya, does. But that's like going into a black hole sometimes. And it can be a very minor mistake where the process time to actually get that application back and get the information can really drive these delays. What would you tell this committee on what we can do better? And where do those folks go in the queue? So if there is just a very minor mistake in the application, that not only how do we delay that time in what it takes to get it back into the appropriate stage, but where do those people sit in the queue, and how can we work on that? Because I think that's part of where some of the major delays come from.
Yeah, I think what I would say is, first, I think we have to have programs and application forms that are kind of easily navigable before clients who come to us. The second is some countries kind of pause the clock when somebody is awaiting information, but 3, they are treated when the information comes in based on kind of that first in, first out principle, noting that we've been waiting for their delay. But Marie-Josée, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's important to make the difference between an application that's rejected at the beginning because we cannot accept it because it's not complete. Then the applicant is asked to do everything again, and then when we receive it, the clock starts again. So there's no waiting for them. If we've started to process the application, we ask for a document. The applicant doesn't lose his place in the queue. We put it back where it was. It doesn't go at the beginning.
Thank you.
In another complete round in, which will be 6 individuals with various amounts of time. Going back to Mr. Redikoff, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Ms. Fox, you did talk about, I want to talk about recommendation paragraph 67 about refugees. Ms. Fox, you talked about the UNHCR process and how that was online in 2022, I believe, and that the non-UNHCR refugees can apply online starting later this month, if all goes well. And at the Immigration Committee, we've heard a lot of witnesses express their desire to decouple Canada's sponsorship a little bit with UNHCR. Many reasons for this, but there's some racism and biases that we've seen in the UN towards certain minorities. And the committee even adopted a motion of mine condemning the UNHCR for this with regard to minority Christians and calling on the Government of Canada to fix this. So I guess my question to Ms. Hogan, when you were doing this audit, did your auditors come across differential treatment between refugees that go through the UNHCR process and those that do not?
I couldn't answer that, but I'm watching Ms. McCullough shake her head no, so I'm going to say no, we did not see differential outcomes through those two programs. We really looked along the lines of country of citizenship, country of residency, and race.
So, as I said at the Immigration Committee, we've heard many cases of bias and racism that occurs in different offices with respect to different groups of people. So I'm a little bit surprised that in your audit you didn't find out anything. I mean, there was nothing in there that you discovered about differential treatment.
So I think to go into that level of detail, I'm going to have to see if Ms. McCullough has something to add to the discussion.
We examined country of citizenship. So we looked at the application processing time and decisions by country of citizenship, and we did find that there was differential impacts among different groups by different countries of citizenship. In terms of the government-assisted refugees, we did not do a breakdown of the source of those applicants, just the country of citizenship of those.
Okay, so you did find differential treatment based on country of citizenship. This is a pretty significant thing because, I mean, there's a whole racism task force. There's a lot of work going on. Mr. Desjardins was speaking about the same thing. It's a large focus, and so I'm a little surprised that it was not given a little bit more importance in here. I know there was a different recommendation on some other things, but the significance of this is that you know, I'm just curious if it was somehow downplayed by the department, or how did the auditors miss this? Because this seems like a fairly big thing. And
so I don't believe that we missed it, Mr. Chair, with all due respect. The differential outcomes was something we highlighted. We actually highlighted the need for the department to better analyze the files that it processes, the backlog it has. Along those lines, I was concerned that they weren't doing that. It was exactly why our recommendation around better use of demographic data needed to be gathered, which was a commitment that they had made in their own diversity, inclusion, and equity plan. So we definitely looked at it. We've highlighted it in different areas throughout the report. So I would respectfully say to the member that it's been covered and it's in there, and there are recommendations that need to be. Yet
in this section on refugees, where there's been numerous witnesses talk about this at different committees, and so we know that this happens, it was not referred to.
Well, we didn't look at the source of the application. No, we looked at the outcome, where it's sitting and how long it was taking, and whether they had
and yet there was
differential
no recommendation here, and that's my concern. Ms. Fox, I want to ask you, you say that 95% of the UNHCR GAR referrals are going through the online portal. It's been over a year where, I'm reading out of the action plan, what's the problem? Why aren't we at 100% on everybody, all the GARs applying online?
So I'll have to dig up exactly the percentage, but I think what I would say is, despite the fact that we offer sort of digital intake, I think it's important for us to have processes by which those who don't have access to be able to kind of make their application from a digital intake standpoint, that there's a way by which we continue to accept those. And I think that's been, not just true of refugees in various camps, but even some rural and remote Canadians have said that they still would like that in-person service or support. So I think it's balancing that, but we can take a look at the reason for the gap. But I think it's probably explained by some limitations with IT infrastructure.
So when I read your action plan, it says December 31st of this year is the deadline to achieve 100% SharePoint use for all UNHCR GAR referrals. So you're telling me it's not going to be 100%. That's never going to happen.
I think what we're trying to do is through the UNHCR come to a system where they can kind of do it for the refugees, so it's not all independent of. So I think if we're working directly with them, that would be the objective, and we're kind of almost there. So we hope to get there by end of December of this year.
Thank you very much. Ms. Khalid, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Excuse me. Thank you so much, Chair. Ms. Fox, I'm just going to pick up on something that you had talked about global applications and the importance of having offices in regions to be more efficient and to be, I think, more equitable in the work that we do. Now, the Indo-Pacific strategy had included some dollar investments for the creation of a number of, or the relocation of visa processing offices. I think one of them was the processing of applications by residents of Pakistan was moved from Abu Dhabi back to Islamabad. I'm wondering, it's been a year now since that has happened. Do you have any updates as to how that is going? Has that impacted applications coming from that region?
Thank you for raising that question. I think that absolutely in our conversation with the Pakistani government, they really wanted us to increase our footprint on the ground. And it was, yes, about processing, but mostly about sort of having the ability to conduct interviews in the Islamabad office. I think that there have been some challenges in getting all of our visas complete. And so there was a caretaker mode given the election in Pakistan. So we've been able to do sort of temporary duty officers, but for kind of a more permanent footprint, we just need to finalize that with the Pakistani government. But interviews are taking place in Islamabad, and our team will be sort of further expanding our footprint given our commitment in the Indo-Pac strategy.
Very much for that. Now, I'm just looking over the management action plan, and I see that between January 2023 and October 2023, IRCC has reduced the spouses, partners, and children, except for Quebec, backlog from 24% to 16% of applications on inventory. I'm wondering, do we have a breakdown as to where these backlogged applications are in the world, as in where the applicants are residing in the world as they wait?
Yeah, we can get that. Like, I can give you sort of right now the overseas sponsored spouse. It went from 20 to 13 months. I think for a sponsored spouse here in Canada, 12 to 10. But from that 13 months, like, where are people? We can definitely give you that data.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And lastly, I will just ask, and again, Mr. Blois said this, we really do appreciate a lot of the work that you do with this. I know how challenging of a file this is. And Canada is held to a really higher standard, I think, from across the world. Wondering if perhaps you can compare where Canada stands internationally with comparable countries in terms of our processes for IRCC.
Well, I think it's fair to say that some of the actions of Canada around sort of refugee resettlement are celebrated around the world. When you leave Canada, there's a huge appreciation for what we are doing. And I think where I'm finding my international counterparts are spending a lot of attention is looking at how we are looking at refugee resettlement in the context of labor pathways. So looking at how we can, rather than categorize people as refugee or asylum seeker or economic immigrant, trying to break down those barriers and indicating that refugees need supports, they need resettlement supports, but they can also contribute and have skills to benefit the country, benefit communities. So I think that's one practice where the international community is looking at our economic mobility program as a bit of a model for use. And that goes with some of our partners, Talent Beyond Borders. And so I think we need to kind of take a look at that and try to expand it as much as we can, and even look at our asylum population. If we are going to get temporary foreign skilled workers, but we actually have a population here, how can we work with private sector to leverage this talent? So I think that's one area that is a focal point for us. But the ecosystem of settlement organizations and resettlement organizations that operate across this country is one of the best ecosystems in the world. And that's to the thanks of the NGOs that do amazing work every day. So those would be some reflections that my partners have shared with me.
Chair, I just wanted to make one last comment, if that's okay.
Yep.
I'm just really proud of a panel of some strong, strong women. You guys are absolutely amazing. Thank you. It's nice to see an all-women panel. Thank you.
Very good. Not the first time, and I'm sure it won't be the last. Et puis encore une fois, Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes.
Madame Desgagnés, a couple of more minutes. Thank you. For this next round of questions, once again, we'll deal with human and financial resources. Over the past few notes, we've noticed that the department, IRCC, one of the departments that has hired the highest number of consultants. So what happened between 2017 2019 that you've quadrupled the expenditures from 6 million to possibly 24 million? Just rounding out the numbers. And what were the results of these increased use of consultants? In the past, it was at $25 million a year. And perhaps you can provide an answer on if you're going to continue to hire as many consultancy services. Or do you think you have enough now that you can, that they've done the job they were supposed to do, and that's enough? Well, there are certain parts of our department which depend on outsourced labor. Healthcare services, temporary. I didn't understand that point at all. Some of our partners, I don't know what, if it says partner or consultant, but we have to refer to expertise that we don't have in-house. No, I'm talking about consultancy firms. Okay. The reason for the increase, first of all, are modernization efforts, which started with the introduction of a new platform. We needed to get some expertise on cloud, for example, cloud platforms. And we have to invest in the talent to renew for new blood in the department. So it refers to our technology budget. Mr. Desjardins.
This will be your last round.
Mr. Chair, there was work conducted in the anti-racism sector by IRCC in previous. To the Auditor General, do you know of a report that was commissioned by IRCC related to anti-racism within IRCC by a company called Polera?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of it.
And to the Deputy Minister, are you aware of this report?
Yes, and we've commissioned 2.
And that report, I'll quote from it, says, you just feel like, now that I'm speaking out, I'm going to be looked at as one of those angry black women for speaking up. And then the report quotes several employees saying that similar items, and then it finally concludes that racialized employees also told Polera, they've been passed over for international assignments and professional development opportunities. The report says one manager claimed that their evaluation of a racialized employee was overridden, quote, by someone above them to promote a non-racialized employee instead, end quote. Racialized IRCC staffers told Polera that they're marginalized in the workplace, kept in, quote, precarious temporary contract positions disproportionately and for a long time, which prevent them from advocating for their own rights, end quote, to promotion or speaking out against racist incidents. That's deeply troubling for me, and it's deeply troubling, I'm sure, to the Auditor General, and it should be deeply troubling to this entire committee, and I hope that, and I'm thanking members of the opposition for continuing that line of debate, because it's most important to this work, and I'd encourage our Liberal colleagues to take more seriously this very important topic, and it's not something worth praising. I do want to continue to make mention that there is a class action lawsuit now by the Public Service Alliance of Canada against the Government of Canada related to their how they've been discriminated against in the public service. And the government has responded with that by spending over $8 million defending itself. Do you think it's time that the country start, in particular your ministry, stop defending against these claims, start working with racialized workers to actually see that their claims are properly heard and that their work in this place is truly appreciated?
I absolutely think that at IRCC we need to work very closely, and that's why we did commission the Polera report. That's why we didn't hide away from having hard conversations.
But you're not doing anything about it.
Yes, we are actually.
You're in a lawsuit.
Mr. Digely, your time is up, but I would like to hear from Ms. Fox, if that's okay. But you know, my rule is once you're over, the witness can finish. But if you interrupt,
I know the rule well.
So, all right, very good. Ms. Fox, you have the floor for a brief answer.
I think what I would say to the committee is that we work very closely with our Black employee network, with our racialized network. We're hearing from them. So how concretely does that change how we make our decisions? One, our XCOM table has become more diverse over the last year, and that is a deliberate action to make representation shift at the heart of the department. Two, empower the networks that we have to give them a voice and give them funding so that they can advocate for different things like mentorship programs, which we're supporting. Three, we create an equity secretariat that has the anti-racism task force and listen to our employees to create an ombudsperson within the department. And four, I think we need to spend a lot of time with middle managers, because the direct environment of employees it is what exactly impacts them every single day in Canada and abroad. So these are some of the measures we're putting in place.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Mr. Kimmick, you'll be the last speaker for the Conservative side.
Thank you, Chair.
5 minutes.
So we've spoken about capacity. Several members have said that, and Mr. Boyce brought up Ukrainians. So I want to bring up Kiawit visa holders, because there was over 1 million applications, over 900,000 were approved. So it's a big source of pressure for the department, and many of those people would then want to apply for PR through different streams, so they'd be affected through all the programs that the AG has reviewed. In the Yates report, though, so internally he found on page 11 that there was an expectation only 10,000 individuals would then seek permanent immigration to Canada through a PR program. Is that 10,000 correct? Was that the thinking of the department?
Yeah, at the time, there wasn't a lot of, that was probably the assumptions that were made at the time, not knowing the length of the context with Russia or Ukraine, not knowing the appetite of people who may, choose to go to other places, Poland, other countries. So I think that was the beginning of the work. I think that work continues, and right now we've launched the PR pathway for 10,000 for family, and we're looking at how do we manage the balance of the program going
forward.
There's
210,178 Kiawit visa holders. I just checked it.
Yep, arrived.
According to Pathfinders for Ukraine, 98% of them intend to stay in Canada.
Yes.
What are you going to do for the rest of them? How can we make sure that these Ukrainians who have fled the war, who have expressed an interest, according to Pathfinders, to stay in Canada, can stay? About 80% of them are happy, 76% of them are working. They want to contribute. So what's the plan to make it work, to make sure they don't get into the troubles of all the PR programs that aren't working very well, that these people won't be impacted?
I think the answer to that is a whole of government effort. It takes the federal government. The provincial nominee program can be leveraged, and we raised it with our provincial and territorial counterparts on how we can work together to use PNP space, to use federal space, to actually welcome people to Canada.
So I've been to enough church basement to know now, including over Thanksgiving, that these Kiawit visa holders, they don't have enough points for express entry, many of them. They're giving bad information by RCC, by lawyers, by immigration consultants, because they're struggling. They don't have their certifications, their licenses aren't recognized in Canada. Many of them are struggling survival jobs. The cost of living is immense. I met a mother with her 18-year-old son here earning $2,800 a month and paying $2,400 a month in rent. So they're just making by. Her son can't go to school. He has to work as well just so they can make by. This is part of that group who we have a program for those who have connections, you have family members here. What I'm asking is the rest of them, is the government going to look at, more information, reaching out to different Ukrainian organizations? This is a group of people who fled sometimes with absolutely nothing. They left their homes. Many of their homes have been destroyed by the Russian army. They have no village, nowhere to go back to. And they've expressed, unlike those in Europe, who have expressed an interest to go back, the ones in Canada have said they would like to stay. So the path to permanent residency for them, what does it look like in the department? Don't say whole of government approach, because every time I cringe, whenever that's said, nothing happens. Nothing happens. It means other people will say, not my job, or they'll do a halfway. They'll just ignore them. They'll point fingers to somebody else. So what I'm asking IRCC, what's this department going to do?
I think that what I can tell you today is that we are looking at those who are here, those who want to stay here, and it is important to note that we have to work with our provinces and territories because they have PNP space in there as part of the levels plan.
Are you going to increase their PNP space?
These are conversations that we're going to have with provincial and territorial governments because I think they have raised with us and we have raised with them the importance of providing some clarity to those who have come here temporarily and what they can expect
Minister,
as the
do you
path
believe the
forward.
Alberta provincial government reached out to you and said we need more provincial nominee spots specifically for Ukrainian Kiawit visa holders, that your department, your minister would be willing to say yes? There was a ministerial meeting of all FPT. Would that be something that the ministry would say yes to?
I think that I will leave that to the minister to make final decisions on
I'll ask him later
attribution.
today,
But I think that it is important that provincial governments who have integrated Ukrainians into their communities also think about provincial programs to accept them in. I think it can be a joint effort, and I think we're absolutely willing to have that conversation with them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kimmick. I understand that for our last, there'd be two sharers, Ms. Shanahan and Ms. Blois. Do you want me to be the arbiter of the time, or would you like to hand that off to your colleague? Okay, I just, we trust you to be fair and impartial like your chair. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Madame Fox, vous...
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Fox, you mentioned earlier in Francophone immigration outside of Quebec that we've already reached the cap. I started in 2014, 2015 the Official Languages Committee, and I know how this was very, very important. We were absent from the scene. So talk to us a little bit about the agreements with the other provinces outside of Quebec. What's it like on the demand side, and what's the progress made? Yes, well, we met them a year in advance, and we got the 4.4%. That was a 2023 target. We hope that this year it will increase again. Through the Official Languages Plan and Strategy, we've worked with EDC Canada to ensure that we can increase those. Up to 6% would be a huge increase, but we have to do promotion, recruitment, specifically to go and get those individuals who want to come to Canada and work closely with provinces and territories to ensure that they have an agreement with us as well in order to increase and improve their percentage of participation. So recruitment campaign, promotion, we have to increase the pool of individuals in order to get the objectives of 6%. That's an excellent piece of news. So I'll cede the floor to my colleague.
I not only try to beat my own score and what I'm capable of, I try to beat my buddies that I'm playing with that are of comparable skill. And Ms. Khalid asked a question, and I think you did a good job talking about the principles behind our immigration. I know sometimes it would be comparing apples to oranges, but countries that have similar types of how's our processing time? That's what I'm more interested in, as succinctly as you can, because I've got another one or two.
Very quickly, I think when I went over to the U.S., I was surprised to see just how paper-based their system continues to be. To give you another example, Australia did a review of their immigration system, and they mentioned Canada 42 times. So I think it is key in terms of looking at systems that work. And I would finally say that other countries have mimicked our express entry point system in order to try to get similar results in terms of talent attraction. So I think that would be some of the comments I would make. Around, processing times, we're constantly looking at it to remain internationally competitive. But those are maybe a few points that I would raise with you to answer the question.
So, and Ms. Hogan referenced this a little bit in her opening comments about setting realistic timelines. And of course, we always look, I want to be lower and lower when I'm on the golf course. You want to have lower and lower processing times in terms of being expeditious. Are service timelines realistic, and how were they developed? Like, who actually, on what metrics are those developed, and is it time for us to perhaps be more realistic with some folks about the challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, I think it's important for us, and this is a good time to reflect on kind of where we're at with service standards. And I think the immigration strategy document that we released kind of indicated kind of step one was getting back to service standard, and step two is actually reevaluating those service standards. And I think now we've got to look at it in the context of where we're at with modernization, right? There are things that are faster than they used to be, and maybe that warrants a change. But there's also a rise in volume. So how can we actually look at volume and impacts in terms of productivity? The third thing I would say is, and particularly on the international student program, the department is looking at setting up a bit of, similarly to the recognized employer, recognized institution. So what does an institution need to demonstrate in order to have access to the program to bring integrity and speed to the level of processing? So more to come, but that's a bit of...
I've got about a minute left. I just want to say, Mr. Kimmich talked about Alberta. I know I used to ask Mr. Bryson when I was before politics about Nova Scotia's PMP being different than Manitoba's. I take notice that we have the Atlantic Immigration Program now, which has been, I think, a relative resounding success. But one number stuck out to me in the OAG report. It was 3% of applications approved within the service standard for the federal skilled worker program. I don't think anyone's asked that specific question. What particularly may have caused that particular delay, notwithstanding? Okay.
That's basically the fact that most of these applicants were sitting in, and don't forget that was end of 2022, the report, not this year, but they applied just before the pandemic, and then they sat in the inventory because we couldn't process people that couldn't come here. And so we stopped the intake, which is good. But if you look at that, these people now are processed within 5 months. So we've adjusted the intake, processed the old cases, and we're back in normal.
Okay, so it was a calculated decision because people were not able to come given the health constraints at the time. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And if you just bear with me before I excuse everyone during the meeting, I just have a couple of questions just from the Chair's prerogative to help the analysts with the report. The first is for the Auditor General. This is related to recommendation 9.64. Has IRCC adhered to all the requirements under the Directive on Automated Decision Making? If not, could you give us some examples from this? And you're welcome to respond now if you like, which I think is the preference. Please go ahead.
Yes, we did find that IRCC did comply with the requirements, particularly to in their quality management of the automated decision-making tool. Our concern was that in using the tool, it wanted to benefit, and in getting into advanced analytics, it wanted all applicants to be able to benefit, but we found that only those that met the criteria to be processed by the tool at that one decision-making point, only they benefited from faster processing times. The shift in reallocating resources to other applicants had not yet taken place.
Thank you very, very much. Next to Ms. Fox, or either of you, this deals with recommendation 9.36. IRCC's anti-racism strategy calls for results for tracking purposes by April 2024. The question we have is, what is the timeline for implementation after the pilot? If you have an answer now, that would suffice, but if you prefer, you're welcome to come back to us as well. But
I think I'd like to maybe talk to the anti-racism task force team, and then I'll come back to the committee.
That's fine. Thank you. And then finally, could you provide the percentage of client satisfaction for permanent residents in fiscal 2022-2023? Again, you're welcome to come back to us with a written answer if you prefer, unless you have
probably written answer. Thank you.
So, thank you very, very much. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for coming in today and for fielding all our questions over just slightly more than the allotted time, and I appreciate my colleagues allowing us to ask and answer those questions at the end. Seeing no objection, I will adjourn this meeting. We'll see you here back Thursday.